Yeah, you see that title. We about to bash us some Canadians for some silly game mechanics today, boys. Self-damage. The old click, bang, and your entire body spaghettifies and becomes one with the fabric of space itself. It's a topic that I am pretty vocal about. I mentioned it in one of my 20 Sins of Warframe videos, I brought it up a few times on Twitter, hell, I've even gone directly to the source and made my whiny bitch baby noises towards some of the developers, who I probably caught during their downtime, enjoying whatever Canadians do for fun when they're not riding moose. Self-damage has a few people defending it, but for the most part has been curb stomped pretty hard by the community. Good. But as a bash topic, it has come back to life so often that even Alan would tell it to knock that shit off. And something I've noticed is that while it gets brought up quite often and people say it's bad, the community at large hasn't really discussed exactly why it's bad. A few content creators have touched on it here and there, like I'm doing here, and a few posts have shown up on the forums and Reddit, but it has yet to get the large community attention like the Great Vacuum War did. And on top of that, the hate for self-damage is starting to devolve into a kind of bandwagon, I feel, which is no bueno. We don't want to be disliking something just because everyone else says that it's bad. I'm looking at you, Conclave. You too, Spaceball! This kind of thing can result in some of the development team turning a blind eye to the issue, and we really don't want that! We have a hard enough time as it is! Someone over on DE's team is fighting tooth and nail to retain self-damage as a mechanic. I'm convinced someone didn't allow Cost a Shot a 100% self-damage reduction. I know you're out there, I bet it's you, Scott! Now, I can't exactly start to control the hive mind that is our community of edgelords and rainbow vomit. I don't have the power to pull another vacuum rework miracle out of thin air, but I can give explanations that folk can rally on when the topic comes up again, so we're not all just saying,
"But if I know."
One thing I'd also like to mention is that I am not against self-damage as a mechanic inherently. My problem stems entirely from how Warframe does it. So, we'll be discussing this self-damage dilemma in a few sections. Here we go. I could almost skip over this part because, I mean, you guys don't have fucking cabbage for brains. It almost feels like I'm insulting your intelligence here. But for the sake of introduction, the purpose behind self-damage is that it acts as a, and say it with me now, balancing mechanic. Yes, balance. That thing that the Californian raisin over here was so rock hard about. Balance is something that everyone has a different opinion on how to go about achieving. And just like Violet Chin here, DE is on the completely wrong side of things, but we'll get back to that. Self-damage acts as a risk versus reward system, and is usually applied to weapons that have very strong positive aspects to them, to the point where their very existence makes the game's obstacles shit their pants. It teaches players to be careful and self-restricts them, and a weapon with it is usually combined with a sparse ammo count as well. The mechanic also inherently hinders its use in close quarters, amongst other things. It's a system that designers can fall back to when they can't just reduce the ammo, or increase the reload, or increase the recoil and bork the accuracy, unless they want the weapon to feel like you're wielding a chainsaw by the ouchurdy part. Hold on to your butts, because I may or may not have failed to mention that this is practically a Team Fortress 2 crossover video. Trust me though, this is still mostly about Warframe. Please put the belts down, dads! I had quite a bit of experience with this game, but now I'm just kind of a forgotten retired player. Such sadness. Before anyone gets onto me in the comments about how these games have two completely separate design philosophies, seeing as how one is largely PvE oriented and the other is PvP oriented, first off, we're not looking at much of TF2 as a whole here. At the end of the day, we're discussing a mechanic that is on display when you're shooting at an enemy or enemies, AI controlled or not. Second, both games have their own PvP and PvE modes respectively, where not many, if any, of their core gunplay mechanics change. With that said, let's get into not Overwatch for a second. We're only going to be looking at the stock weaponry to keep things simple. In TF2, most normal weapons that have high damage have a good deal of restrictions and caveats attached to them. The scattergun and shotguns can put out a lot, but obviously you have to be very close and they can only really handle one target at a time. The sniper has some of the highest damage output in the game, but it's very narrow, requires pinpoint precision as well as a charge up, and again, it can only really handle one target at a time in most cases. The minigun can do quite a bit, but it slows you to a snail's pace and drastically limits your ability to use your secondary weapon since you can't switch off of it immediately. But now, let's introduce our good friend, the soldier. But more importantly, it's his primary weapon that we want to focus on, the rocket launcher. The rocket launcher sports some incredibly good benefits once you notice all the issues with other high damage weaponry. It's pinpoint, it has a long range, it has a splash radius, it deals an incredible amount of damage, is capable of two-shotting most of the cast, and it acts as a mobility tool. Its only real weaknesses are its long reload and small load capacity, but both of those things aren't terribly detrimental thanks to, you know... So, of course, another penalty needed to be added. That penalty, obviously, was self-damage. But the way self-damage is implemented here is that it actually respects the fact that, hey, no one is perfect. It expects you to have a moment where you're rounding a corner and all of a sudden a scout appears in your face, and your first instinct is to panic launch a rocket, likely smearing him all over the room, to the point where you can't tell if it's his blood and his lime green paint mixing, or if it's a Muriel of a watermelon. It takes a good few rockets for a full health soldier to turn himself into meat stew, but yet each one still does take a decent chunk of health away. It also lets the soldier use his brain to determine if bringing his launcher into this really close in space with 50 HP is a great idea, or if he should instead retreat or take out his secondary or even his melee so he doesn't accidentally blow his ass out of his helmet. This is an instance where self-damage is causing a player to restrict themselves, but in a fair way. The soldier is given plenty of warning that using his launcher at such a health deficit can be a potential issue. Something that's also worth noting is that in TF2, your projectiles do not collide or interact with teammates. This is important to note because players should not be afraid of firing the rockets when they're within their own team's ranks. Another thing that makes the rocket launcher so appealing is that, at least when just considering the stock weaponry, it doesn't really have much competition to deal with in regards to its role. It's one of the few forms of long-range, high-damage AoE. The only other weapon I can think of that does this is Devilman's grenade launcher and sticky launcher, but both of those weapons have downsides of their own. The reason this is important to note is because this means that the rocket launcher's job is not at risk of being trampled upon by superior options. We'll be coming back to this point when we get to Warframe's failures, which we're doing right now. Warframe took a drastically different approach to implementing self-damage, but to be fair to the devs, they did have a pretty good reason for wanting it. Warframe's arsenal has a pretty clear design philosophy. They're typically good at small groups and single engagements, but lose effectiveness against bigger groups. Most rifles and beams only shoot in a narrow line, shotguns have fall off restricting them to short range, etc, etc. But Warframe abilities tend to be much better at dealing with big hordes, but at the cost of energy rather than ammo, the former being a much more valuable resource. However, and keep this in the back of your head, there are a number of weapons that are clear exceptions to this design. We'll get back to those exceptions later. This is where explosive weapons come into play though. Very much like the soldier's rocket launcher, weapons like the Ogress and the Penta do have pretty good advantages mechanically wise. They try to break the mold by offering more area coverage and higher damage at the risk of occasionally taking off some of your own health. At least I think that was the intent, because in reality, this went tits up and failed miserably. Obviously, the biggest problem with Warframe's iteration is the fact that it's too harmful to players. One misclick can send your ass to Jupiter and turn it into an orbiting satellite. This happens for a pretty simple reason. Weapons in PvE are designed to deal with enemies, not yourself. In TF2, you and your opponents all have very similar HP ranges, so self-damage naturally balances out a bit better. On top of the fact that characters like the soldier have innate damage resistance to their own rockets. In Warframe, a number of enemies have far more effective HP than a player. Even the tankiest Anaris or Chroma cannot even come close. Thus, player weapons tend to be incredibly powerful to compensate. But when you translate that to self-damage, what DE doesn't seem to understand is that you can't just slap self-damage on your system and expect it to work. It's interesting too, because even they can't seem to decide what they should do with self-damage. Certain weapons like the Ogress have absolutely zero failsafes. If you shoot a rocket near yourself, you're going to find yourself in the Space Tesla's passenger seat. In your coffin. But then you have weapons like the Corinth, which purposefully do not explode if the explosion is anywhere near you, making it almost impossible to blow yourself up. Yet it still has self-damage on the projectile. Which begs the question, why bother keeping it there if it's never even a threat in the first place? I'm guessing it was just a code port from an older weapon. You also got the Lens, which is the best explosive launcher in the game, which gives you a chance to escape if you happen to shoot it too close to you. But then you have the Angstrom. Weapons weapons with self-damage simply do not do enough to warrant the risk of obliterating yourself. It's not just the self-damage system that's a risk, but also other factors. You know how I mentioned earlier that in TF2, you don't have to worry about teammates blocking your shots? Yeah, that's not the case here. It is very much possible to insta-give yourself just because an ally happened to cross in front of you just as you fired. That is completely out of your control and a great example of an outside mechanic pulling a bamboozle on you. On top of that, they just don't measure up stat-wise for them to be worth the current risk. Some of these weapons that are unfortunate enough to have the self-damage tag on them don't even stand out particularly when it comes to performance. Stat-wise, some of them only have performance that can be best described as a shit muffin with sprinkles on top. So here's the Ogress, right? With our current flawed system, the Ogress's stats, in my opinion, would have to look something like this for it to be worth using. Now, you of course might be thinking, Trib, are you fucking cabbage brain? Those stats are ridiculously broken. And yes, they are. But remember, the risk is insta-giving yourself if you fuck up a shot. Something that a teammate could accidentally cause, and given how many tiles are really in close spaces, that also exacerbates the risk. I also give it such a big-ass boost because using the Ogress is inherently more risky than using something like, say, the Lens. So under DE's current system, it only makes sense to reward a weapon with stupid high stats when it has a bigger risk attached. But of course, this is not a great way to justify just how bad the self-damage system currently is. This boost in stats would only be necessary if DE kept their current implementation of self-damage, which you shouldn't, DE. That's a no-no. A mod we're talking about here is Cautious Shot. Cautious Shot is a prime example of why the self-damage system is fucked beyond all recognition. On top of costing an absurd amount of endo and mod points to use, when this mod first shipped with its 90% self-damage reduction, people were still falling over on their asses. And even today, if your weapon is strong enough, even with that minuscule 1% self-damage, you can still break your kneecaps. But that is not the only reason that this mod isn't the band-aid fix that DE was hoping for. For one, it completely neuters explosive weaponry in terms of damage output. You know, the thing that most people think of when they think of an... Not only does it slap your weapon with a negative 15% damage penalty, remember that this also consumes a mod slot. Mod slots are expensive real estate. A single mod slot that is being used for some weird niche is a mod slot that isn't going towards more practical functions. It's a slot that isn't being used for a hefty increase in damage. It's a slot that isn't bringing your fire rate up or your crit chance up. In a way, using Cautious Shot isn't just a negative 15% damage penalty. It can also be a negative 48% crit chance penalty, or it can be a negative 60% elemental damage and status chance penalty. That's why a ton of frame augments go unused. Why would you take something like Mesa's staggering shield when you can use that slot for something more useful? Mod slots are incredibly valuable. Cautious Shot does not respect this. Also, it can only be used on a minuscule number of weapons, which is asinine, DE! But let's get to the final nail in the coffin. And it is a huge nail. The number one reason why DE's self-damage system does not work is... In TF2, one of the reasons the rocket launcher is so good is because there's not a ton of weapons that can do what it can. Remember how I mentioned that before? Now, this may or may not still hold true today, what with the game's many unlockable weapons, but when factoring in the vanilla game, this was most certainly true. In other words, the rocket launcher has or had little competition. But here, on the other hand, when a weapon with self-damage comes along, it is almost immediately chucked into the dumpster for two main reasons. The first reason, remember how I said that while there is a design philosophy behind Warframe's arsenal, that there are some weaponry that are exceptions? These exceptions climb onto the table and piss in self-damage's cornflakes. For example, the Zetastar is a long-lasting, huge AoE disc that puts out damage along a wide radius and benefits from stealth bonuses. The Static Core is an AoE burst machine that also happens to sport no self-damage. The Toroid launches projectiles that explode in AoE clouds. The Pox does the same thing, but in the form of a secondary. The Amprex can link to multiple targets targets at once and melts them super fast. But hold on, we're not done. These exceptions prove something that is very significant to note. A weapon with good area coverage and damage without self-damage does not break the game. You don't see 70% of the player base running around with a Torrid or a Pox. You don't see frames disregarding their abilities just because the Sinistar exists. They're certainly strong, but they're also proof that DE's fears of not having strict self-damage in the game are completely unfounded. I don't know who that one person at DE is who is holding onto their current self-damage system like they're hanging from a cliff, but mate, your fears are completely non-existent. I wanted to bring this up especially because when DE sees this kind of discrepancy in their design, they tend to act on it in a monkey's paw type fashion, where they'll fix it, but not in the right way or in the expected way. For instance, instead of looking at these findings and opting to lessen or remove self-damage, it's unfortunately far more likely that DE would instead add self-damage to these exceptions or otherwise nerf them in some way. Now, you may think that I'm putting actions into DE's mouth, but there's proof of them doing this plenty of times in the history of the game. They actually tried to put self-damage on the static core a few updates ago, and it was even successful in getting put into the game. But they immediately backpedaled and undid the nerf when they realized that might not be the best idea. And wouldn't you know it, the static core isn't breaking game balance. Sure, it's a strong weapon, but it's not nearly as strong as DE may think. With so much weighing against their current system, it may just be time to take a step back and realize that weapons like the Penta, the Angstrom, or the Tsar and so on are being bested by their competition, and that's not because the competition is overpowered. It's because the Ogress has a 5% crit chance. Haha, why? But we're still not done. Trust me, I wish I was. My throat is dying from this recording session. It feels like how Vor looks. In TF2, classes don't really have dangerous abilities. At least, not in the sense that they can cause direct damage to others. Scout has his double jump, Spy has his cloak, etc., but nothing that does direct damage like an Excalibur Exalted Blade or whatever. So a weapon like the rocket launcher is only having to compete with other classes' arsenals. This is something that Warframe's self-damage arsenal unfortunately does not get the luxury of. They not only have to compete with other weapons, but they also have to compete with abilities. Something like Hildren's Balefire Charger completely obliterates any reason to risk using something like the Coalstar. Want more examples? Mesa's Peacemakers, Saren's Spore and Miasma, Gara's Shattered Lash and or Mass Vitrify, Nova's Antimatter Drop, Octavia's Mallet, Revenant's Laser Ballet, Volt's Discharge, the list goes on and on and on. Yes, these powers do cost energy, and energy is quite valuable, but energy has also become increasingly more easy to obtain, be it through auras, focus, arcanes, or, ironically, through powers themselves. Most damage-dealing abilities are created in such a way that they affect more enemies than your standard bullet hose usually can. And against the few weapons that do have competitive area coverage, like the Sinistar for example, they usually put out the damage faster to compensate for the need of energy. But at least with something like the Gorgon, you don't have to worry about accidentally bludgeoning yourself to death with it. Warframe's failures in regards to self-damage can be summed up through the following points. Self-damage is too harsh. In its current state, self-damage is achieving the completely wrong goal. Instead of encouraging players to be careful in a certain circumstance, it's encouraging players to never use anything with it in the first place, or at the very least, has them be overly cautious the entire time they're wielding one. That's further compounded by low rewards for the high risk. Weapons with self-damage only support average to above average stats at base, and somehow some have mediocre stats at worst. Warframe completely disregards that the point of self-damage is to offer high power in return. In addition, weapons like the Ogress, which is far more dangerous to use, offer less reward than something like a Lens, which is inherently more safe to use. Inconsistent implementation. Jumping from the previous point, DE cannot keep a focused mindset when designing weapons that have self-damage. Some have failsafes, such as the Corinth or the Toncore, whereas some weapons like the Coalstar have no such thing at all. They introduced a ridiculously expensive mod band-aid in the form of Cautious Shot, but it's only usable on a select few weapons for no particular reason. Though, mind you, that mod shouldn't even need to exist. It's an abomination that seems like someone over on the development team went, "Fine, have your stupid fix," and then they proceeded to make it drain a fuck ton of resources out of spite. Self-damage weaponry is bested by better tools. Why use the Angstrom when you can use the Static Core? Why use the Coalstar if you have Balefire Charger? larger. But at least with the static core, it doesn't have to deal with the other negative of self-damage. Going back to the second point, almost every weapon with self-damage attached to it give almost no valid reason to use them over other weapons and tools. They don't have vastly increased stats to compensate, resulting in those weapons just feeling like any other tool but with an extremely harsh negative slapped onto it. Now obviously, the community does not all share a collective opinion. I have seen plenty of people attempt to defend self-damage. Play around it this, and don't be bad at video game that. But that's kind of like saying that you can technically drive a car without a chassis. Just play around it, don't get into a crash, forehead! Just because you can doesn't mean that it's well designed. You could also play around self-damage if it was actually properly implemented, you know? Just because you can, say, stay in the air forever to negate ever blowing yourself up, that doesn't make it enjoyable. I've also seen people say how self-damage needs to stay in its current form because macroma. To which I reply, what makes more sense? Reworking or removing a system to benefit everyone else? Or keeping it just so that one frame can exploit it? And Dragons, seriously, if you want to charge Vex armor and an Eidolon or whatever, just go get stepped on, it works just as well. Self-damage is probably my longest running issue with this game. It kills the use of so many weapons. I immediately shelved the Z-Huge Prime once I got it and regulated it to mastery fodder, not because I disliked how it performed or that its stats are bad for a run-of-the-mill weapon, but because it was unfortunate enough to get slapped with the self-damage system, which is DE's fatal guillotine blow as far as I'm concerned. And I am not the only one who shares this feeling. When your balancing mechanic is killing people's interest in a weapon right out of the gate, that should tell you that, something isn't quite right, Chief. So, to the rest of DE, if you can find that one guy who is sitting in the corner of your office cuddling his self-damaged body pillow, drag him kicking and screaming away from it. Hold an intervention, whatever it takes to get rid of his sadistic fascination. Now, if you'll excuse me,